The day a group of homeowners destroyed my yacht was the day they accidentally declared war on the one person who controlled the only shortcut into their neighborhood. I didn't know that when I woke up that Tuesday morning. Honestly, I thought it was going to be a normal day, just another morning at the marina, another stack of maintenance invoices, another round of inspections before tourist season kicked into full gear. Instead, I found myself standing on a dock watching a $2 million yacht being ripped apart by a crane while a man in a golf shirt smiled like he had just won an election. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 44 years old, and for most of my life, I've worked around boats. Not the glamorous side of boating that people see on Instagram, but the dirty side. Diesel engines, corroded fuel lines, saltwater damage, the kind of work where your hands stay stained no matter how much soap you use. 22 years of that work allowed me to buy something most people thought was impossible for a mechanic. Back in 2015, I purchased Harbor Point Marina just outside a small coastal town in South Carolina. It wasn't some billionaire purchase. It was the result of decades of 12-hour shifts, skipped vacations, and living below my means while everyone around me upgraded their trucks and bought bigger houses. The marina sat on a little over 6 acres and included 24 boat slips, repair building, parking areas, storage space, and one thing that turned out to be far more valuable than I realized at the time, a private access road. That road crossed a corner of my property and connected directly to an upscale gated community called Seabrook Estates. For nearly 30 years, the residents had used it as a shortcut. Nobody ever challenged it. The previous owner didn't care. When I bought the property, I didn't care either. It saved people a few minutes on their commute, and they occasionally brought business to the marina. Everybody got along. Then Trevor Langley moved into Seabrook Estates. Trevor was one of those guys who had been rich long enough to think success made him automatically smarter than everyone else. He had sold a software company years earlier and retired before 50. Nice house, fancy cars, the kind of smile that always felt like a challenge. Within 2 months of moving into the neighborhood, he somehow became president of the HOA. Looking back, that should have been the warning sign. The first time we met was actually pleasant. He stopped by the marina, shook my hand, complimented the property, and asked a few questions about the boats. I remember thinking he seemed all right. Then the letters started showing up. The first one demanded $600 a month for maintenance of what Trevor called our shared roadway. I laughed when I read it because there was no shared roadway. The road belonged entirely to me. My deed showed it. The survey showed it. The county records showed it. I called my attorney just to make sure I wasn't missing something. He spent about 10 minutes reviewing everything before saying, "Ethan, if this road belonged to them, then I guess I own Disney World." That pretty much settled it. I politely declined. A week later, another letter arrived. Then another. Then another. Each one became more aggressive. Trevor wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding. According to him, every property owner benefiting from the road had an obligation to contribute to maintenance costs. The problem was that I wasn't benefiting from the road. I owned the road. After the 4th letter, I responded through certified mail. Then again after the 5th. Then again after the 6th. By the time we reached 9 separate letters, I had explained the situation so many times I could practically recite the property records from memory. That's when things started getting personal. At HOA meetings, Trevor began referring to my marina as an eyesore. Residents later told me he claimed my operation was lowering property values. He called the repair yard an environmental risk. He said some of the larger yachts looked excessive and inappropriate for the community image. Community image. I still laugh about that phrase. We're talking about a marina that existed decades before the subdivision was even built. But Trevor had a gift for convincing people he was protecting them from some imaginary threat. One afternoon, an older resident named Linda stopped by my office. She'd lived there for years and usually came down to watch the boats. She sat across from me, looking uncomfortable. "You should know Trevor keeps bringing you up at meetings," she said. "What kind of things?" I asked. She hesitated. "He thinks you're disrespecting the community by refusing to contribute." I leaned back in my chair and couldn't help laughing. "Linda, I own the road. I know that. Not everyone does." That conversation bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not because I was worried about the HOA, Legally, they had no case. What bothered me was realizing Trevor wasn't fighting over money. $600 meant nothing to him. This was about control. He couldn't stand hearing the word no. And people who can't handle being told no usually become dangerous when they finally hit a wall. I just didn't realize how dangerous until the morning my phone started vibrating nonstop. At first, I ignored it. Then I noticed 3 missed calls from marina employees and 2 text messages that simply said, "Get down here now." I opened the security camera app on my phone and immediately felt my stomach drop. A crane sat on Dock C. Several workers were attaching cables around the hull of my yacht. And standing beside them, hands on his hips like a movie villain who couldn't believe his own success, was Trevor Langley. The camera feed shook slightly as the yacht began lifting from the water, and in that moment, I knew something very bad was about to happen. I don't remember the drive from my house to the marina. I remember grabbing my keys. I remember running out the front door. I remember every red light feeling like a personal insult. But the actual drive itself is a blur because my eyes never left the camera feed on my phone. The workers had already lifted the yacht several feet into the air by the time I got halfway there. It was a 62-foot vessel I'd spent years restoring, not because I needed it, but because it represented something. Every late night, every overtime shift, every sacrifice I'd made was sitting in that slip. And now a crane operator who had no idea what he was touching was swinging it around like patio furniture. When I pulled into the marina, I heard the cracking sound before I even got out of the truck. Anyone who's spent enough time around boats knows that sound. Fiberglass doesn't scream. It cracks. Sharp. Violent. Belmano. The yacht slammed against the edge of the dock and a section of the hull split open. One of the support cables shifted unexpectedly and the stern dropped several feet. Metal twisted. The steering assembly shattered. A worker yelled something I couldn't make out. Another one started waving his arms. The entire operation instantly transformed from confidence to panic. I jumped out of my truck and started running. "Stop! Stop right now!" I shouted. The crane operator froze. Several workers turned toward me. Trevor didn't. He just stood there watching the damage unfold. I reached the dock breathing hard and looked directly at him. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked. Trevor calmly adjusted his sunglasses, removing a liability. For a second, I actually thought I had misheard him. "That's my yacht. It's creating safety concerns. It's sitting in my marina. According to the HOA board, it required immediate action." I stared at him, trying to understand how someone could say something so ridiculous with a straight face. Then one of the workers approached me. He looked nervous. "Sir, are you the owner?" "Yes." He swallowed. "We were told the HOA had authorization." I pointed directly at Trevor. "Did he show you ownership documents?" The worker's silence answered the question. Trevor immediately stepped in. "The matter has already been reviewed." "By who?" I asked. "The board." I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because it was so absurd my brain couldn't process it normally. The board. The board of a homeowners association thought they could seize and destroy property sitting inside a privately owned marina. That was their legal strategy. The workers finally realized they had been dragged into a disaster. One of them quietly walked away and started making phone calls. Another began taking photographs. Trevor's confidence started slipping around the edges. Not much, just enough for me to notice. I called the police before I called my lawyer. That's how serious it was. Within 30 minutes, officers arrived. Then more officers. Then supervisors. They reviewed the footage. They reviewed property records. They reviewed permits. The story unraveled quickly because there wasn't much to unravel. Trevor had no authority. The HOA had no authority. Nobody had authorization to touch that yacht. One officer eventually looked at Trevor and asked the question everyone else was thinking. "Sir, what made you believe this was legal?" Trevor actually answered. "We voted on it." The officer blinked. "You voted on someone else's property?" Even now that conversation makes me smile. Because for the first time all day, Trevor looked uncertain. The following week became a blur of insurance adjusters, marine inspectors, attorneys, investigators, and repair estimates. The final damage report landed just under $200,000. Not cosmetic damage, Structural damage. Major repairs. The kind that follows a vessel forever. Every future buyer would know what happened. Every future survey would reveal the history. It wasn't just damage to fiberglass. It was damage to value. And once that number crossed a certain threshold, things became criminal. Very criminal. The district attorney's office opened an investigation. Detectives requested footage. Witnesses were interviewed. The crane company cooperated fully because they realized they had been misled. Several HOA board members suddenly developed selective memory. Trevor stopped returning calls. Then one afternoon my attorney called me. "You sitting down?" he asked. "Should I be?" "Felony vandalism charges are being filed." I remember staring out across the water for a long moment. The marina was quiet. Seagulls floated overhead. Boats rocked gently in their slips. Everything looked peaceful. Yet a man sitting less than a mile away had just managed to turn a $600 argument into a felony case. That's when I made a decision. Not out of anger. Not revenge. Just clarity. For years, I'd allowed the HOA residents to use my road because it seemed neighborly. But neighborly relationships depend on mutual respect. And respect had clearly left the building. 2 days later, contractors arrived. Then electricians. Then surveyors. Then security installers. People around town started asking questions because the amount of equipment showing up looked excessive. Massive steel posts. Automated gate systems. RFID readers. Security cameras. Barrier arms. Backup generators. I wasn't building a fortress. I was simply exercising property rights I'd ignored for years. Every installation was perfectly legal. Every permit was approved. Every measurement matched county records. By Friday afternoon, everything was operational. Saturday morning, new signs appeared. Private road. Access restricted. Authorized users only. The reaction was immediate. Monday morning was chaos. The shortcut that normally allowed residents to reach the main highway in less than a minute was gone. Suddenly, they had to drive around the marshlands using county roads. What used to take 30 seconds now took nearly 15 minutes. That may not sound dramatic until you multiply it by every commute, every school pickup, every grocery run, every doctor's appointment. By lunchtime, my voicemail had exploded. People were furious. Some thought it was temporary. Others assumed the county would intervene. A few left messages accusing me of punishing innocent residents. Those calls bothered me because many of those people genuinely were innocent. Most had no idea what Trevor was doing behind closed doors. But every time I started feeling guilty, I replayed the security footage. I watched my yacht hanging from those cables. I heard the cracking fiberglass. And the guilt disappeared. Around the third day, something interesting happened. The anger shifted. At first, residents blamed me. Then they started asking questions. Why had the road been closed? Why were criminal charges involved? Why was the HOA suddenly consulting attorneys? Why was Trevor refusing to attend community meetings? Information spreads fast in wealthy neighborhoods because people have time to investigate. Once the truth surfaced, public opinion flipped like a light switch. Residents learned the road belonged to me. They learned Trevor had initiated the dispute. They learned about the yacht. They learned about the criminal investigation. Most importantly, they learned they were suffering because one man couldn't accept hearing the word no. The community Facebook page became a battlefield. Screenshots started circulating. Property records appeared. Former board members began posting comments. One resident wrote, "So we're adding 20 minutes to every trip because Trevor wanted to win an argument?" Another responded, "Not an argument. A power trip." Then local media got involved. The story was irresistible. Wealthy HOA president. Private marina owner. Destroyed yacht. Criminal charges. Access road dispute. It practically wrote itself. The first news headline appeared on Thursday evening. By Friday morning, every resident had seen it. By Saturday afternoon, reporters were calling my office. Through all of it, Trevor disappeared. No public statements. No explanations. No apologies. The silence became louder than any defense he could have offered. Then came the city council meeting. That's where everything finally started collapsing. The city council meeting wasn't supposed to be dramatic. At least that's what everyone told me beforehand. It was scheduled as a routine public discussion regarding access concerns, traffic complaints, and community impact. On paper, it sounded boring. In reality, it felt like the final scene of a courtroom movie where everyone already knows the verdict, but still wants to hear it spoken out loud. The room was packed. Residents filled nearly every seat. Reporters lined the walls. Camera crews occupied the back corners. I arrived carrying a simple folder that contained property deeds, surveys, certified letters, photographs, and copies of every communication I'd sent during the dispute. Across the room sat Trevor. For the first time since this entire mess began, he looked tired. Not angry, not confident, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from realizing consequences are finally catching up. When my turn came to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack anyone. I simply laid out the timeline, the road ownership records, the certified letters, the repeated warnings, the requests for cooperation, the yacht damage, the criminal investigation. Then I showed still images pulled directly from the security footage. The room became completely silent. One council member actually removed his glasses and stared at the screen for several seconds before shaking his head. After that, the questions shifted toward Trevor and the HOA board. Some answers never came. 3 board members resigned within days. They claimed personal reasons. Nobody believed them. Residents began organizing petitions. One after another, homeowners signed their names demanding leadership changes. People who had supported Trevor just weeks earlier now wanted distance from him. The political collapse happened faster than the original conflict. Then came the legal reality. The district attorney's office wasn't bluffing. The evidence was overwhelming. The footage existed. Witnesses existed. Documentation existed. Trevor was staring at the possibility of serious criminal penalties. About a week after the council meeting, my attorney received a phone call from Trevor's legal team. Suddenly, everyone wanted to negotiate. Funny how that works. When people think they're powerful, they send demands. When they realize they're vulnerable, they send lawyers. We met in a conference room overlooking the harbor. Trevor arrived with 2 attorneys. I arrived with one. Nobody smiled. Nobody made small talk. One of Trevor's lawyers opened by talking about compromise, community healing, and moving forward together. I listened politely. Then I slid a contract across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "A solution." They spent several minutes reading it. The silence grew heavier with every page. The agreement established a formal 10-year lease granting the community legal access across the road. Monthly payments would be required. Parking agreements would be required. Late payment penalties would be enforced automatically. Access rights would exist only as long as contractual obligations were honored. Everything was legal. Everything was enforceable. Everything was written by professionals. Then came the final section. Full restitution for the yacht damage. Trevor stared at that page longer than all the others combined. Finally, he looked up at me. "You planned this." I leaned back in my chair. "No, Trevor. You planned this. You just didn't realize it." One of his attorneys actually laughed before quickly trying to hide it. 3 days later, the agreement was signed. Shortly afterward, Trevor resigned as HOA president. The criminal case concluded through a negotiated plea arrangement that required restitution and probation. He avoided jail, but only barely. The reputation he spent decades building disappeared almost overnight. As for the residents, most of them eventually accepted the new arrangement. Some even apologized. A few stopped by the marina personally. One family brought homemade cookies. Another sent a handwritten note. Linda, the resident who had warned me months earlier, visited one afternoon and sat on the dock watching boats come and go. "You know," she said, "a lot of people thought you'd eventually reopen the road for free." I laughed. "Why?" "Because that's what you've always done." I looked out across the water for a moment before answering. "Being kind and being foolish aren't the same thing." She nodded slowly. "Fair point." Life eventually settled down. The marina continued growing. New tenants arrived. Business improved. Property values increased. Ironically, the attention from a news coverage ended up bringing me more customers than I could handle. Years later, Harbor Ridge Marina is worth several times what I originally paid for it. The road remains open under contract. The gates still work perfectly. And every now and then, I see Trevor driving through. We don't stop and chat. We aren't friends. But something strange happened after all of this. He started waving. The first time it happened, I thought it was an accident. The second time, I realized it wasn't. Maybe it was politeness. Maybe it was embarrassment. Maybe it was his way of acknowledging that the fight ended exactly where it should have. Honestly, I don't know. What I do know is that this entire story was never really about a road, a yacht, or even an HOA. It was about what happens when power convinces someone they're untouchable. Trevor wasn't defeated because I was richer, smarter, or stronger. He lost because facts don't care about confidence. Property records don't care about titles. And reality doesn't bend just because someone is used to getting their way. Looking back, the part that still fascinates me is how avoidable everything was. If he had simply accepted no for an answer, none of this would have happened. No lawsuits, no criminal charges, no public embarrassment, no expensive contracts, just neighbors living their lives. Instead, a small disagreement became a disaster because one man needed to win at all costs. And that's the question I still think about sometimes. If you were in my position, after watching someone destroy your property, cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, and drag an entire community into chaos, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have reopened the road under a contract? Or would you have left those gates closed forever? Let me know in the comments, because even now, years later, people still argue about whether I was fair or whether I was far nicer than Trevor deserved.